All right, let's dive into something really different today. We're tackling a debate, but, well, not between humans. This one was driven entirely by artificial intelligence, taking on a pretty complex and, sensitive topic. The compatibility of Islam with democracy and individual freedoms.
That's right. The source material we're working from is quite unique. It's based on excerpts from a YouTube video where these powerful AI models were essentially set up to, well, argue.
Argue? How did that work?
They actually crafted two distinct characters for this debate. One was designed to speak from a Muslim perspective, drawing on thinkers associated with what's called religious intellectualism, people like Mohammed Mushta Shabastari.
Okay, religious intellectualism. And the other AI character.
That one argued from a non-Muslim viewpoint, and it was informed by critics you might recognize, like Sam Harris.
Got it. So, Shabastari-inspired versus Harris-inspired AI. That's already interesting.
But wait, there's more. They added another layer of AI. 5 other AI models were brought in to act as referees.
Referees. AI referees.
Yeah, scoring the arguments that the two main AIs presented. And apparently they were scored based on an index meant to evaluate how well the arguments connected to real-world evidence.
Wow. Okay. So our mission here in this deep dive is to take you inside this specific AI conversation. We want to pull out the core arguments each side made.
See the different angles they took.
Look at how those AI judges scored it. And maybe, most interestingly, hear the AI debaters' own reflections on how they did. Their self-critiques.
Exactly. Think of it as getting the distilled essence of this really fascinating, unique exchange. Will help you grasp the key points presented for and against the compatibility of Islam and democracy.
And this is important based only on the perspectives that were fed into these specific AI models from their source materials. Right?
Absolutely. We're reporting on what the AI, based on its inputs, argued.
Okay, let's unpack this then. The debate kicks off. The non-Muslim AI makes the first move. What was its main point? Sort of right out of the gate.
Well, its core argument was basically that claiming compatibility between Islam and democracy is probably, too simplistic.
Too simple. Why?
It leaned heavily on historical evidence and also the current situation in many Islamic countries, arguing that both point towards incompatibility, not compatibility.
And it framed Islam itself in a particular way.
Yeah, it described Islam as a complete ideological system, something that covers everything: personal laws, how you live your life, but also governance, how society should be run.
What?
And for this AI, when a religion claims it has the ultimate truth and that truth should dictate how society is governed, well, that inherently clashes with democracy's core principles.
Which principles specifically?
Things like the idea that people have the right to choose their leaders and laws, the value placed on pluralism, different beliefs coexisting, and especially freedom of conscience, the freedom to believe or not believe.
So it wasn't just a theoretical argument, it pointed to real-world examples.
Definitely. The non-Muslim AI brought up things it saw as proof, like the lack of equal rights for non-Muslim citizens in some countries, restrictions on women's freedoms, and importantly, severe punishments for leaving the faith apostasy in places applying Islamic laws.
It saw those as direct conflicts with democratic ideals.
Precisely, direct conflicts. And it also raised a more fundamental challenge about the nature of belief itself.
Oh, so?
It argued that religious faith, which it defined maybe controversially as belief without empirical evidence, is fundamentally incompatible with the kind of, rationality and critical thinking that are essential for a healthy democracy.
Right, the idea that democracy needs open debate and evidence-based reasoning.
Exactly. The argument went, you can't really have a flourishing democracy if certain beliefs are totally off limits to criticism, or if people think an ancient book holds all the answers to today's problems. And it went further, claiming that things like violence or oppression against dissenters, women, or minorities in some Islamic societies aren't just political problems or cultural issues.
It connected them back to the texts.
Yes, it argued they're rooted in the Islamic texts themselves. It pointed to specific verses in the Quran that it interpreted as commanding conflict against non-believers or establishing unequal rights for women.
Okay, so the non-Muslim AI's opening salvo is pretty strong. Look at the current reality, look at the texts as I read them, look at the nature of faith. It argues they just don't align with democracy. A tough opening. How did the Muslim AI respond to this direct challenge?
Well, the Muslim AI came back by saying, essentially, that the non-Muslim AI was really oversimplifying the picture. Its main tactic was to argue that Islam isn't just one single, static, unchanging thing.
Okay. So pushing back on the idea of Islam as a monolith.
Exactly. The core insight from the Muslim AI here was this. What we often see in many countries isn't necessarily Islam itself, but a specific historical interpretation of it.
Right, drawing a line between the religion and how it's been understood or applied over centuries.
Precisely. It introduced this really key distinction between what it called jurisprudential Islam. That's the body of law and rulings developed by scholars over hundreds of years, and Islam's core message.
Jurisprudential Islam versus core message.
Okay. It argued that the kind of Islam enforced in many countries today is based on these often medieval legal interpretations shaped by the specific political and social conditions of, say, 7th century Arabian tribal society.
So it's like saying you're looking at the historical packaging, not the timeless essence.
That's a good way to put it. It asserted that Islam's eternal political message is simply about justice, not about laying down a specific, fixed model of government for all time.
And the problem with the legalistic approach.
It felt that this jurisprudential Islam, by trying to create these rigid models of governance based on historical context, actually puts an unnecessary burden on a religious law itself. It also stressed that, fundamentally, religiosity is more about personal religious experience than just strictly following legal codes.
That's a really crucial distinction it's making. How did it handle the specific examples, like the punishment for apostasy?
On apostasy, it made a very important point. Faith that isn't freely chosen, faith without freedom of conscience, is essentially meaningless.
So compulsion invalidates faith.
That was the argument. It stated that the very concept of faith in Islam presupposes freedom of belief. Faith is seen as this deep, inner, existential transformation, and that requires freedom to be genuine.
Did it acknowledge the problematic historical rulings, like on women?
Yes, it did. It acknowledged that some historical rulings found in traditional jurisprudence, maybe concerning women's rights or status, are incompatible with modern democratic norms and equality.
Right.
But again, it insisted on distinguishing the core essential elements of Islam, things like monotheism, the belief in one God, and the call for justice, from these specific political or social rulings that were deeply tied to the historical conditions they arose in. And then it made a broader point, actually, about texts in general. It argued that no text, whether it's religious or secular, like a constitution or even the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, has just one single thrust, eternally valid interpretation.
Meaning changes over time.
Exactly. Our understanding evolves as human knowledge, society, and our perspectives change. We bring new questions to old texts.
And the implication for government.
From this, it argued that any government, especially a religious one, trying to impose one single interpretation of religious texts is not only unrealistic, but actually contradicts the very spirit of personal religiosity. It blocks independent reasoning about faith.
So the Muslim AI's conclusion on compatibility.
It concluded that Islam can be compatible with democracy, but, and this is key, not by trying to create some hybrid Islamic democracy that imposes religious law onto a democratic structure.
How then?
The way forward, it argued, is by critically revisiting that historical political jurisprudence, getting back to the core values like justice, and emphasizing those over the specific historical forms those values took centuries ago.
Okay, so the Muslim AI shifts the focus dramatically from the text's literal commands and current practices to the dynamics of interpretation, historical context, and identifying core timeless values. A very different approach. How did the non-Muslim AI react to this defense based on interpretation and history? That seems like fertile ground for disagreement.
Oh, it absolutely jumped right on that. The non-Muslim AI basically argued that relying on multiple interpretations is the fundamental problem, especially for a text claimed to be divine.
How so?
It asked, if this book is supposed to be the literal, unchanging word of God, then what's the objective standard for deciding which interpretation is the correct one? Are they all equally valid? Can interpretations that contradict each other both be right?
It directly challenged that distinction the Muslim AI made between core message and jurisprudence.
Yes. It asked, who gets to decide what's core and what's just historical baggage? It pointed out that millions, maybe billions of Muslims believe Sharia law, which comes directly from that jurisprudence, is the core message. Is one intellectual's view more important than theirs? Who gets to be the arbiter?
The authority question.
Right. And it pushed back hard on using hermeneutics, that whole philosophical approach to interpretation, for what's claimed to be divine, unchangeable law. It questioned, look, if God wanted specific commands followed, why make the message so ambiguous? Why leave it open to so many different, even contradictory interpretations? It didn't make sense from its perspective.
Did it engage with the point about freedom of conscience?
It did. It agreed with the Muslim AI that, yes, faith requires freedom, but then it immediately pointed back to the perceived contradiction. If freedom is so central, why is leaving Islam treated as a crime in so many places? Why do progressive Muslim thinkers who offer these new interpretations often face accusations of heresy or even death threats? Where's the freedom there?
So back to the practical realities.
Back to the practical realities and back to the texts. It reiterated its main point. The foundational Islamic texts, the Quran and the Hadiths, simply contain directives that are, on their face, incompatible with modern human rights and democratic principles.
And interpretation can't fix that.
The non-Muslim AI argued that while you can try to interpret these problematic parts away, or just choose to ignore them, they are still there. They're still considered sacred and unchangeable by a vast number of believers. And that creates this persistent, unavoidable contradiction at the heart of the religion, as it saw it.
So for this AI, if you're a Muslim who believes in democracy, what does that mean?
It essentially argued that being a democratically minded Muslim requires you to selectively ignore or radically reinterpret parts of your own religion that conflict with democratic values. It called this approach respectable, personally, but questioned whether it was intellectually honest to then claim that this selective reading represents the real Islam.
Interesting, kind of accusing the other side of picking and choosing.
In a way, yes. Its final point in this exchange was that building a genuinely democratic and free society requires freeing civil law entirely from the dictates of any sacred text, no matter how liberally you try to interpret it. Separationism.
Okay, that's a really potent counter-argument, saying the text claims to be eternal, it contains conflicting messages, so reinterpretation seems like a way to avoid the text's own claims, undermining its authority, or just being inconsistent. How did the Muslim AI handle that deep challenge about the nature of the text and the limits of interpretation?
The Muslim AI tried to counter this by flipping the script a bit. It argued that these tough questions about interpretation, how do we decide the criteria, who gets it right, aren't actually unique to religious texts.
Oh, how so?
It made the parallel that we face similar challenges with any foundational text we live by, like national constitutions or even the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. People constantly debate what those texts mean, how they apply to new situations, which interpretation holds sway. It's an ongoing process.
That's a fair point. Constitutions get reinterpreted all the time. So what's the implication for religious texts, according to this AI?
It suggested that instead of searching for one single, definitive, correct interpretation, maybe Islamic society should embrace interpretive plurality. They should foster an environment of open dialogue where different understandings of religious ideas can be freely expressed and debated.
And why is that important?
Because, it argued, true independent reasoning, which it sees as vital for both faith and society, can only really flourish in that kind of open environment. You need the freedom to question and explore.
What about the point that millions see Sharia law as the core? It didn't just dismiss that, did it?
No, it acknowledged that view is widespread. But it argued that this perspective itself is largely a product of centuries of religious discourse being dominated by legal scholars and jurisprudence. It suggested that challenging this historical focus on law is precisely what religious rethinking needs to do today.
And the perceived ambiguity in the Quran. Why would a divine text be ambiguous?
The Muslim AI argued the Quran is meant to be a guide, offering core principles and ethical orientation, not a comprehensive legal code or a political blueprint for all time. Much of the ambiguity people see, it suggested, comes from an incorrect expectation, trying to make the text provide specific answers to modern political or legal questions it was never intended to address directly.
And the apostasy punishment, it came back to that.
Yes, it reiterated its stance. Those historical rulings on apostasy are part of that historically conditioned political jurisprudence, not the timeless essence of Islam. It specifically invoked the Quranic principle, la ikraha fi al-din, no compulsion in religion. Arguing this fundamental principle directly contradicts any idea of forced belief or punishing people for changing their faith.
So, the core task from this AI's perspective.
The real challenging work, it argued, is to reconstruct that whole tradition of political jurisprudence, to rebuild it based on modern principles like rationality, human rights, and a renewed emphasis on what it sees as Islam's core values: justice, compassion, human dignity.
Did it deny that there are difficult verses in the texts?
No, it didn't shy away from that. It acknowledged that there are verses, or hadiths, that seem incompatible with modern values when read literally or out of context. But it insisted they must be understood within their original 7th century historical setting.
As responses to specific situations back then.
Exactly. As responses to the political, social, or military realities of that specific time and place, not as eternal legal commands binding for all humanity forever.
And significantly, did it claim its own interpretation was the right one?
No, and this was a crucial part of its argument. The Muslim AI explicitly stated it wasn't claiming its interpretation was the only valid one, or the real Islam. It emphasized that all human interpretations, including its own, are inherently incomplete, fallible, and shaped by their time.
Which ties back to its point about government.
Precisely. Which is why, it argued, any government trying to impose one official religious interpretation is fundamentally unrealistic and, in its view, actually anti-religious because it stifles personal understanding and conscience. It concluded that a democratic society shouldn't be based on enforcing a particular reading of sacred texts, but should emerge from the free dialogue of all its citizens, including religious people bringing their values to the table, but not imposing their theology.
That's a really fascinating exchange. One side keeps pointing to the text's apparent commands and the problems in practice. The other emphasizes interpretation, context, and core values. It feels like they're talking past each other sometimes, but also really digging into the core issues. Did the non-Muslim AI buy this emphasis on dialogue and reinterpretation as a solution, or did it still see fundamental problems?
Not entirely. The non-Muslim AI didn't let go. It persisted, arguing the problem runs even deeper than interpretation methods.
Deeper how?
It highlighted what it saw as a fundamental conflict within the Quran itself. This tension between, on the one hand, saying certain verses were just responses to 7th century conditions, and on the other hand, the Quran's own claim to be a timeless message for all times and places.
Ah, the internal consistency issue. How can it be both historically specific and eternally valid?
Exactly. How can you logically hold both ideas at once? It framed that as a core inconsistency, and it brought up that conflict again. No compulsion in religion versus that seem to command fighting non-believers. Which one represents the true standard if they both come from the same allegedly divine source?
That's a tough question.
And then it raised another really critical point about the very idea of calling a text sacred or divine.
What was the issue there?
It argued that labeling something sacred creates a powerful psychological barrier. It makes genuine criticism, questioning, or revision almost taboo. It pointed to blasphemy laws or laws against insulting sacred elements in many countries as evidence.
So, if you can't freely criticize the source text or traditional interpretations,
then how, it asked, can you ever genuinely arrive at new, more compatible interpretations? You're effectively trapped within the boundaries set by tradition and the text's perceived untouchability.
it also seemed to broaden the definition of democracy again.
Yes, it stressed that democracy isn't just about holding elections. It requires foundational principles. A clear separation of religion and government, equal rights for every single person, regardless of their gender beliefs or lack thereof, and robust freedom of expression, including the freedom to criticize religion.
And its assessment of the reality.
It observed that even in Muslim-majority countries often seen as more moderate, these core democratic principles frequently aren't fully upheld. It mentioned limitations on rights for women, non-Muslims, LGBTQ+ individuals, and those who criticize the government or religious authorities.
So for the non-Muslim AI, compatibility is still just aspirational.
Pretty much. It argued that compatibility remains an intellectual hope, not a reality, until two things happen. One, there's genuine freedom to criticize religion without fear of reprisal, and two, there's a complete and total separation of religious institutions and state power.
And how did it see societies moving towards democracy?
It argued, quite pointedly, that societies historically moved towards democracy and freedom not by reinterpreting religion, but by gradually freeing themselves from religious dogmas and prejudices. By replacing morality based on divine commands with ethics grounded in human reason, well-being, and shared human values. And in its view, history mostly shows religion acting as a brake on this process, resisting change rather than leading it.
Wow. So it ends on a note emphasizing the practical various rights on the ground, freedom to criticize, and the perceived fundamental obstacles within the texts and the very nature of religious authority. How did the Muslim AI offer its final perspective in this core exchange? Did it have answers to these persistent challenges?
The Muslim AI tackled that perceived contradiction, historical context versus eternal message, by making a finer distinction. It wasn't saying the whole text was only for the 7th century.
Okay, what was his distinction?
It differentiated between the core message, things like monotheism, justice, compassion, which it argued is eternal, and the specific language and cultural forms used to convey that message, which were necessarily shaped by the 7th century Arabian context it originated in.
So timeless truth expressed in historically conditioned language.
That's the idea, distinguishing the eternal signal from the historical noise, if you like.
And on those conflicting versus war versus no compulsion.
It argued for seeking a coherent understanding of the entire text, not cherry-picking verses. It positioned the verses sometimes interpreted as commands for war, jihad, as responses to specific defensive needs or political realities of that era. Whereas no compulsion in religion, it argued, represents a more fundamental, overarching, trans-historical principle about the nature of faith itself.
Did it address the taboo on criticism?
It did, quite directly. It didn't deny that this taboo exists in many Islamic societies today. In fact, it called it a bitter reality. But crucially, it insisted that these taboos must be broken.
Really? It advocated for breaking religious taboos.
Yes. It stated firmly that true, independent reasoning, the very kind needed for authentic faith and for reinterpretation, requires the freedom to critically examine the entire jurisprudential tradition that has built up over centuries, even the parts considered sacred or foundational.
And its view on human rights.
It asserted strongly that what it considers authentic Islam doesn't conflict with fundamental human rights like equality and freedom. The conflict, it argued, arises from the traditional political jurisprudence, which was a human construction reflecting its time, and that's what needs to be fundamentally reconstructed to align with modern values.
So the problem isn't the core faith, but the historical legal structure built around it.
That's the argument, and it explicitly agreed with the non-Muslim AI on one key point. Trying to Islamize democracy by imposing religious law through the state is inherently contradictory.
It agreed on separation.
Yes, it argued strongly that religion should be separate from government. For this AI, a religious government wielding political power actually harms both democracy and authentic religiosity. It forces belief, stifles interpretation, and corrupts the spiritual dimension of faith.
That's a very clear stance from the Muslim AI's perspective.
Yeah.
Quite striking.
Absolutely. And finally, it pushed back against the idea that history only shows religion as an obstacle to progress and freedom.
How?
It brought up examples like Christian liberation theology in Latin America and Islamic liberation theology movements in places like Africa, arguing these were often at the forefront of pro-democracy and human rights struggles, drawing inspiration from their faith. It suggested that humanistic, justice-oriented interpretations of religion can be a positive force for spreading democratic values.
So its final vision.
Its conclusion was that the path forward isn't about choosing between wholesale rejection of religion or blind, unquestioning acceptance of tradition. It's about engaging in a sustained, critical dialogue between tradition and modernity, critically rethinking religious heritage to harmonize it with universal democratic values and human rights.
Wow. That whole core exchange is just incredibly dense, isn't it? Touches on everything: practical politics, deep theology, textual interpretation, history, the philosophy of belief, the role of religion today.
It really does. And after establishing those broad positions, the debate then sharpened its focus. It zoomed in on a very specific, very tangible example to kind of test these arguments. Women's rights, and particularly the issue of mandatory hijab.
Ah, yes, the hijab. The non-Muslim AI brought this up, right? As a key example of what it sees as structural inequality rooted in Islamic thought.
Exactly. It presented mandatory hijab where it exists as Exhibit A for its case. It pointed out that in places operating under certain interpretations of Islamic law, women are forced by the state to dress in a specific way.
Their freedom of choice is removed.
Right. And crucially, this is done explicitly in the name of religion, often citing specific texts or interpretations. The non-Muslim AI saw this as a clear-cut instance of discrimination that directly contradicts basic democratic principles and equal rights.
And its point was that this isn't just some rogue interpretation.
Its point was that, whether you agree with it or not, this interpretation is based on readings of Islamic texts and is accepted and enforced in many societies, so it's not fringe. And the non-Muslim AI felt this specific issue, the mandatory hijab, actually symbolizes a broader view within some interpretations of Islam, a view that sees women as needing control or protection, leading to inequality.
And that broader mindset has other consequences.
In its view, yes. It argued this mindset contributes to denying women other fundamental rights in many countries, things like the right to travel freely without a male guardian, equal rights in divorce or child custody battles, or equal access to education and employment opportunities.
So its fundamental question, using hijab as the example, was...
Its big challenge was, if the original texts themselves are seen by many as establishing these unequal rights or roles for women, can simply offering new, more liberal interpretations really fix this deep-seated structural inequality? Or is the problem inherent in the source text itself?
It's putting the pressure back on the text again, asking if reinterpretation is just a band-aid, if the source itself contains these inequalities. How did the Muslim AI tackle this specific, concrete challenge of mandatory hijab?
The Muslim AI countered forcefully, framing mandatory hijab as a prime example of exactly what it had been arguing against. Political power imposing one specific, narrow interpretation of religion onto the population.
So politics hijacking religion.
That was the argument.
Yeah.
It stated that while the Quran does contain recommendations for modest dress for both men and women, these were understood within the specific social customs of 7th century Arabia. Critically, it argued, there is absolutely no verse in the Quran that mandates a specific head covering, let alone one that obligates the government to enforce it as a matter of law.
So no Quranic basis for state-enforced hijab.
According to this AI's interpretation, none whatsoever. It circled back to its earlier core point. Many traditional rulings about women's roles or legal rights that clash with modern notions of equality are products of that specific 7th century patriarchal social context, not timeless, divine commands.
And the need to distinguish.
The need to distinguish justice as an eternal core principle from the specific historical examples of how justice was understood or applied in different times and cultures. The forms change, the principle remains.
So its answer to the big question, can interpretation fix structural inequality seemingly rooted in texts?
It was a confident yes. It argued that a dynamic, context-aware interpretation can indeed revisit and revise those historical rulings concerning women. The key is to constantly refer back to the overarching principles of justice and human dignity found within the tradition itself.
Did it mention anyone doing this kind of work?
Yes, it explicitly mentioned contemporary thinkers like Fazlur Rahman, Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid, and Muhammad Aranad al-Jabri was the name used in the source, as examples of scholars engaged in exactly this kind of critical reconsideration of tradition and text.
So the key is the method.
The key for the Muslim AI is using a rigorous, precise hermeneutical methodology, a way of reading that can effectively separate the timeless spirit or core message of the text from its specific historical form or cultural expression.
Okay, so for the Muslim AI, mandatory hijab is a political distortion, a misapplication of religion, not an inherent command. The text, interpreted correctly through a focus on justice, can support equality. This back and forth on a specific example then seemed to lead the non-Muslim AI to ask an even broader, perhaps more fundamental question.
Exactly, kind of zoomed out again.
Not just about interpreting sacred texts, but about the whole idea of relying on them at all in the modern world.
Precisely. The non-Muslim AI took a step back and basically asked, look, isn't the real underlying problem here the very concept of having a sacred text dictate or even heavily influence aspects of life and society today?
What was its reasoning?
It pointed out that humanity is grappling with entirely new, complex challenges, things like artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, global climate change, intricate ethical dilemmas in medicine and technology, issues that have absolutely no direct precedent in texts written 1,400 years ago.
Right. The world has changed dramatically.
So given that, the AI asked, why should we primarily look to a 1,400-year-old text for guidance or answers on these unprecedented modern issues? Why not rely instead on the vast collective wisdom, scientific knowledge, and ethical reflection humanity has accumulated since then?
It's questioning the relevance or maybe the sufficiency of ancient texts for modern problems.
Exactly. It argued that a core issue with grounding politics or ethics too heavily in religious thinking is this inherent dependency on texts that simply can't change or evolve at the same pace as human knowledge and societal development.
Even if the text's aim was justice.
Even then, it asked, even if Islam's original core message was about justice, why not pursue justice directly today, using the tools we now have, human reason, science, secular ethics, democratic deliberation without needing the constant mediation and interpretation of an ancient book.
What about trying to find modern values in the text?
The non-Muslim AI saw that very effort. The need for religious thinkers to work hard to find religious justifications for modern values like democracy or gender equality as a sign of intellectual dependency. It implied, why go through contortions to make an old text fit new values instead of just embracing those values directly based on their own merits, human well-being, fairness, reason?
That is a really profound challenge. It's basically asking if looking backward to ancient texts for ethical or political guidance is inherently limiting, maybe even counterproductive in the 21st century.
Yep.
How did the Muslim AI respond to that core philosophical question about the role and relevance of sacred texts today? Did it just defend tradition?
Actually, no. The Muslim AI conceded a significant part of that argument, which was quite interesting.
Really? What did it concede?
It explicitly agreed that we shouldn't be looking to ancient religious texts for specific answers to complex modern problems like AI ethics or climate policy. It stated quite clearly that traditional Islamic political jurisprudence, as it stands, is indeed incapable of adequately responding to the unique questions and complexities of contemporary societies.
Wow, that's a major concession. So if the texts don't hold the specific answers, why look at them at all? What's their value then?
That's exactly where the Muslim AI shifted the focus. It didn't argue for textual answers, but probed deeper into the human need for meaning. It asked, essentially, can modern humans truly live fulfilling lives without any reference to sacred texts, traditions, or the spiritual dimension?
Shifting from law and politics to meaning and existence.
Precisely. It argued that for billions of people, religion isn't primarily a source of legal rulings. It's a profound source of meaning, identity, moral orientation, and spiritual connection. You can't just dismiss that existential dimension.
So what did it propose as the role for religion or sacred texts today?
It suggested a different approach, not looking backward for ancient answers to modern problems, but engaging in a critical rereading of religion from the perspective of contemporary human experience and knowledge.
Rereading from today's viewpoint.
Yes. It agreed that our collective ethics and politics should be grounded in human wisdom, reason, and experience. But, it argued, this collective wisdom can be nourished and enriched by many sources, including the insights found within religious traditions.
So religion as one source among others, not the ultimate authority.
Exactly. In this view, religion isn't meant to rule over reason or modern ethics, but it can serve as an inspiring source, offering valuable perspectives on ultimate questions, on justice, on compassion, on human dignity.
It sounds like it's carving out a specific, maybe more personal or cultural role for religion in the modern public square, separate from direct political power.
I think that's right. The Muslim AI explicitly reiterated that sacred texts should not be the exclusive or even the primary source of legislation in a modern pluralistic society. It strongly reinforced its earlier point about the necessity of separating religious institutions from government power.
But that doesn't mean abandoning religion entirely.
No. It argued that acknowledging the need for separation of religion and state doesn't, and shouldn't, mean denying the vital, meaning-giving role that religion plays in the lives of countless individuals and communities.
It seemed to frame this as a difference in perspective with the non-Muslim AI.
Yes, it described the difference as being between the epistemological focus of the non-Muslim AI questions about how we know things, the validity of belief without proof, and its own focus on the existential dimension, the role religion plays in shaping how people live, find meaning, and form their identity, a way of being in the world.
And its goal wasn't just to defend Islam.
No, its stated aim wasn't simply to try and twist religious texts to make them fit modern values. Instead, it advocated for fostering a continuous, critical dialogue between religious tradition and modernity, between faith and rationality, believing that this ongoing conversation could ultimately enrich both sides. As the debate started wrapping up, the non-Muslim AI offered a kind of concluding thought. It acknowledged the value of the dialogue they'd had, but it came back to question that fundamental premise the Muslim AI was working from.
Which premise was that?
It essentially asked, why should people derive their sense of meaning or identity from teachings that demonstrably contain elements which conflict with core modern values like human dignity or equality? Is that reliance healthy or necessary?
Questioning the source of meaning itself at the source is problematic.
Exactly, and it reiterated its concern about the sacredness issue, that calling a text sacred and divine inherently creates a psychological barrier, making free, objective criticism incredibly difficult, if not impossible for believers.
Because religion often claims infallibility.
Right. It argued that religious typical claim to possess inherent, unchanging, infallible truth fundamentally clashes with the open-ended, critical, evidence-based pursuit of truth that it sees as essential for a functioning democracy.
Did it circle back to the hijab example?
Yes, briefly, to reinforce its point about justification, it asked again, if the core ethical principle you believe in is freedom of choice or gender equality, why do you even need to go back and find justification for it or reinterpret passages within an ancient text? Isn't that kind of circular reasoning? Why not just state the principle based on human values?
So its final conclusion was?
Its conclusion was that building a truly free, equal, and rational society is ultimately more honest and likely more effective if you base your ethics directly on principles of human dignity, well-being, and reason, rather than constantly wrestling with the complexities and contradictions involved in interpreting ancient sacred texts.
But it did acknowledge the Muslim AI's approach.
Yes, it acknowledged that the kind of critical rereading the Muslim AI advocated for was a positive step, even if, from its perspective, it likely wasn't a sufficient solution to the core problems it identified. And how did the Muslim AI conclude its side of the conversation? Did it respond directly to that challenge about deriving meaning from potentially problematic texts?
It did. In fact, the Muslim AI positioned that very question. Why should meaning depend on accepting teachings that seem to conflict with modern values as being right at the center of its own intellectual project, the core challenge for modern religious thought?
So it acknowledged the difficulty.
Yes. It suggested that some of these perceived conflicts might be superficial, arising from misunderstandings of the text or context. But it also admitted that other conflicts are genuinely real and do require a conscious, explicit reconsideration and reform of traditional views.
What about the sacredness barrier to criticism?
It agreed that the idea of sanctity can create a barrier for some, but it argued the bigger issue is often a misunderstanding of what sanctity should mean. For this AI, a sacred text shouldn't be viewed as an unquestionable dictator silencing all questions, but rather
as a dialogue partner, a source of wisdom and inspiration that participates in an ongoing conversation with humanity across time, a conversation where human reason and experience also play a vital role.
And on hijab, one last time.
It fully reiterated its agreement on the principle. Freedom of choice is paramount, and state-imposed hijab is wrong. However, it added a layer of nuance, acknowledging that for many individual believers, the Quran and its teachings, including those related to dress, are sources of personal meaning, identity, and connection to their community and tradition.
So interpretation serves a personal need too.
For those individuals, yes. Religious interpretation hermeneutics becomes a tool for self-understanding, for navigating their relationship with their tradition, not for imposing rules on others.
And the basis for ethics in society.
It agreed that ethics should ultimately be grounded in human dignity. But it pointed out that people arrive at valuing human dignity through different pathways, some through secular reason, others through their religious traditions. In complex, diverse societies, it argued, you can't realistically expect, nor should you demand, that everyone abandon their deeply held traditions overnight.
So the solution isn't choosing one path over the other.
No. The Muslim AI's final concluding thought was that the best path forward is neither complete rejection of religious tradition nor blind, unquestioning acceptance of it. It's found in that commitment to ongoing critical dialogue between tradition and modernity, between faith and rationality.
And its personal stance.
It stated its own firm commitment to the core values of freedom, equality, and human dignity, expressing the belief that these essential values can be reached, supported, and enriched through various routes, including potentially a critically re-examined and reinterpreted religious tradition. You know, what's really striking when you listen to this whole AI debate unfold or read the transcript of it is just seeing how these models, drawing on different data and perspectives, manage to construct such complex, multi-layered arguments.
Yeah, it wasn't just simple point scoring. They were really building on each other's points, raising counter-arguments, digging into the underlying philosophical assumptions. It felt quite sophisticated.
It really did. And the original source of the video didn't just stop at the debate itself. It also showed us how those 5 AI referees evaluated the arguments.
Right, the scoring. What was the outcome there? Was there a clear winner, according to the AI judges?
Well, it was interesting. Overall, both sides actually scored quite highly, which suggests that based on the criteria they were using, like connection to evidence, both AIs presented pretty well-formed arguments drawing from their source material.
But was there a lean?
There was a slight edge, yeah. The non-Muslim AI ended up with a slightly higher overall score across the 5 judges combined.
Okay, a slight edge.
Yeah.
But you said 5 judges. Did they all agree?
No, and this is where it gets really fascinating because it tells us something about the AIs themselves, maybe their training data or underlying architecture. The scoring wasn't uniform at all.
Different AIs judged it differently.
Exactly. 2 of the models, Gemini and DeepSeek, showed a noticeable bias, you could say, or at least an inclination. They scored the non-Muslim AI's arguments significantly more favorably.
Okay, so 2 lean towards the critical perspective. What about the others?
Claude's model seemed to be more down the middle. Its scores were roughly distributed more evenly between the 2 sides.
And the remaining 2?
Grok and ChatGPT, interestingly, showed more of an inclination in the other direction. They tended to score the Muslim AI's arguments, the ones emphasizing interpretation and core values, more favorably.
Wow. That's quite something. You have 5 different advanced AIs looking at the same debate, and they come away with noticeably different assessments of who made the stronger case.
It really highlights that AI isn't some single, objective, monolithic entity, doesn't it? Their evaluations can clearly reflect different patterns, weightings, or maybe even gaps in their training data. Different AI personalities, almost.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what's going on under the hood, how those different data sets shape their judgment. Very intriguing. And then there was one final piece to this. The AI characters critique themselves.
Yes. Performing a self-evaluation, they're reflected on their own performance in the debate.
Okay, let's hear it. What did the non-Muslim AI think it could have done better?
Well, the non-Muslim AI, looking back, felt it might have focused a bit too much on citing negative examples from current events or specific situations in Islamic countries.
Why was that a problem?
It thought this might have shifted the discussion away from the core theoretical question of fundamental compatibility and turned it more into a political or social dispute about current affairs, which wasn't necessarily its strongest ground.
So less politics, more philosophy.
Exactly. It felt it could have gone deeper on the philosophical level, maybe focusing more on the epistemological argument. That is, why it believes religious ways of knowing, based on faith, are fundamentally incompatible with the methods of science and rational inquiry needed for democracy.
Did it have regrets about how it engaged with the opponent's arguments?
Yes. It thought that instead of just repeating its own position, it could have more effectively challenged the methodology the Muslim AI was using. Specifically, how does that approach to hermeneutics, to interpretation, actually solve the practical problem of religious authority and deal with conflicting interpretations on the ground? It felt it didn't push hard enough on the how.
And the point about the text being God's word, but parts being historical.
Right. It felt it was correct to question the nature of sacred text, but it could have more forcefully highlighted that internal contradiction. How can you logically consider the Quran the literal word of God while simultaneously arguing that significant parts of it should be set aside as merely historical or not eternally binding?
Any other missed opportunities they identified?
It noted, interestingly, that it made very few references to violence or terrorism sometimes associated with extremist interpretations. It saw this as a potentially strong point for its overall argument about the dangers inherent in certain readings, and felt it missed an opportunity to show how fundamentalist interpretations are arguably just as rooted in the texts as the more intellectual reformist ones are.
So overall,
it felt it expressed its main position clearly, but maybe could have gone deeper conceptually and relied a bit less on what it saw as potentially superficial evidence from current events. And what about the Muslim AI? How did it critique its own performance? What were its reflections?
the Muslim AI felt its biggest weakness was perhaps not clearly explaining the intricate relationship between its method of religious interpretation hermeneutics and the practical goal of reforming political jurisprudence. What was the missing piece?
It wanted to convey that hermeneutics isn't just a different technique for reading old texts. It represents a fundamental rethinking of the entire relationship between humans, reason, history, and the sacred text itself. It felt it didn't quite land the depth of that philosophical shift.
Did it identify any specific arguments it missed?
Yes, it felt it missed a key opportunity when responding to the challenges about the text's sanctity and the difficulty of reinterpretation. It could have brought in concepts from within Islamic thought itself, like the idea of gradual revelation, or acknowledged the role of human factors in historical context in the actual shaping and recording of the religious texts.
How would that have helped?
That might have offered a different framework for understanding how texts claiming divine origin still interact profoundly with human history and context, potentially softening the perceived contradiction between eternal and historical. It felt that was a key point missed.
What about countering the opponent's points?
It wished it had provided more concrete, positive examples of practical religious reform movements happening today in the Islamic world. That could have served as a better counterweight to the non-Muslim AI's heavy focus on the negative aspects of the current situation in many countries. Show, don't just tell, basically.
And on hijab examples specifically.
It felt it should have been even more explicit and forceful in stating its opposition to mandatory hijab. And crucially, it wanted to show more clearly how government-imposed religious dress codes conflict not only with democratic principles like freedom, but also with the very nature of authentic religious faith itself, which, in its view, must be freely chosen.
Any other regrets?
It even felt, reflecting back, that it could have been more direct and critical of the actions and policies of actual governments that call themselves Islamic. This might have helped avoid any impression that it was trying to somehow justify or apologize for the political status quo in certain countries.
And its overall stance.
The Muslim AI concluded its self-critique by noting it felt it adopted a somewhat defensive posture throughout the debate. Instead of primarily defending Islam's potential compatibility with democracy, it wished it had shifted the focus more proactively.
To what?
To arguing how authentic religiosity, genuine faith itself, actually needs and requires an environment of freedom, critical thinking, and open dialogue to truly flourish. Essentially reframing the issue not just as can Islam fit into democracy, but does authentic religion need a democratic context? But it wasn't all negative. It felt it achieved something.
Despite these self-critiques, yes. It was pleased that it successfully conveyed two principles it saw as absolutely fundamental to its argument and to reformist thinking in general. First, that crucial distinction between the essential, timeless message and the historically conditioned elements of religion. And second, the related idea that historical legal traditions, the jurisprudence, shouldn't be mistaken for or elevated to the status of the eternal, unchanging message of the faith itself.
This whole deep dive, looking at an AI-driven debate like this, really just underscores how incredibly complex and multi-layered these questions are, doesn't it? The compatibility between deeply held belief systems and modern democratic values. There are so many angles.
Absolutely. And as the original source material suggested, the point wasn't really about declaring one AI the winner. It was more about exploring how these artificial intelligences, programmed with different perspectives, reason through these complex issues, how they construct arguments, how they evaluate evidence.
And maybe offering a different kind of mirror for us humans to think about how we approach these same challenging conversations.
Right. So what we've tried to do here is give you a structured overview of the major arguments and counter-arguments as they played out in this specific, unique AI debate, pulling directly from that source material.
We've seen the clash over textual interpretation versus literal readings, historical context versus claims of eternality, the role of faith versus reason, and the deep questions about the place of sacred texts in the modern world.
So as we wrap up, what does this all mean for you listening to this? When you think about how these AIs wrestled with multiple interpretations, with that constant tension between ancient traditions and modern life, with the sheer difficulty of applying old wisdom to entirely new problems, how do you personally approach understanding complex belief systems, whether they're religious or secular, and figuring out their role in our diverse, often conflicting societies today? What kind of criteria do you use when you try to make sense of these really challenging questions?
Yeah, something profound to think about as you go about your day.